So since then, we moved on, and Jay's continued the work into researching sonication and other modalities for modifying the mind, basically moving into altered perception, altered states in the context of a spiritual development system. And he's working with spiritual teacher Sinjin and to make this happen. So Jay, tell us a little bit more about what you're doing these days.
Sure, I'm happy to. I have some slides prepared for you too, if you want to see some visuals. But yeah, as Sanjay said, the work in the lab is really devoted to really two things: trying to understand how mindfulness practice and other types of practices that can lead to deep inner shifts. So we're talking perceptual shifts, ego shifts, spiritual shifts. We're interested in all types of different lived and felt phenomena and how that affects a person's life. And then trying to use the tools of science to understand those, partly because we're geeks and we want to understand the brain and nervous system changes. But the real deep motivation is to try to figure out how to take that stuff to the masses. We want to scale it out, and we want to try to find out how to use science to, in the first case is use these interventions for treatment for things like depression and anxiety, which, as you know, have increased dramatically over the past 2 years. But then to create protocols to give more people access to those changes, those transformations, and doing it in a way that is integrated and healthy. And so part of the work is trying to find catalysts or facilitators for the practice. So using things like brain stimulation, psychedelics, neurofeedback, breathing techniques. We're interested in all kinds of things, just like Sanjay, which just sort of sample everything and trying to find something that helps people accelerate their practice. The other half of the work is really focusing now on trying to help people integrate those state changes or transformations that they might experience so that they can, let's imagine someone gets lucky enough to experience freedom from the self structure, the ego for a minute, maybe through a psychedelic intervention. How do you help a person do a practice to integrate that into their life so that they can bring some of that insight or put that system back together in a useful and functional way? So really you can sort of think of that as the integration piece of our work. And I've been working with Shenzhen on that to try to figure out ways, for example, for psychedelic practices to help people integrate some of those state changes so that they can carry that into their life and live with a little bit less attachment, live with a little bit more peace from some of the negative patterns that can emerge, and then learning to do other types of practices outside of the psychedelic intervention, like mindfulness practice, for example, that continues that change in their life. So really sort of focused on that and trying to understand how we can use science, how we can use the tools of wearables. I've got wearable trackers. I can track your sleep and your heart rate and your temperature. Can we use that wearable information to help the integration path? And how useful can it be? Or should we just give up on the quantification piece, and should we just focus on the practices that have been developed over thousands of years? So really it's, in Shenzen's vernacular, he wrote a book called The Science of Enlightenment. So it's really trying to understand how these old practices and the sort of what you might call the path, the spiritual path, interacts with this new science, and how we can use the new science to bring this to more people. So that's the large context. Do you want to dig in more to that, Sanjay? Or?
Yeah, let me say something to thank you for the whole broad context. Just so happens, that Jay and I were interested in, that's how we became friends. We're interested in the same things. I've been doing neurofeedback and brain stimulation for many years and teaching meditation. And I'm very interested in this intersection of technology and practices, and also a word about, and especially in integration of deep spiritual shifts. Since I've been working with people to support deep spiritual and ego shifts in them, then I found the need in myself, particularly, and then in helping other people to integrate these shifts into their life. And a word about tracking, actually, that's one way I got into doing neurofeedback, is I was doing a lot of meditation and teaching it. And then I got connected to EEG, brain waves, and biofeedback with brain waves. And I started to see how my own meditation patterns were being reflected in the brain waves after as I was learning about them. For example, I have a tendency for depression and sinking mind and low energy, and and that often corresponds to more power in the low frequency brain waves such as theta. And I noticed that if I did training in which biofeedback training in which I reduced theta, then I had better focus and better balance in my meditation. So there's this correlation between opposing factors in meditation, such as relaxation and softness, soft focus, with energy and sharp focus. And in a balanced state, you have these opposing factors being balanced. And it turned out, I didn't realize this until I started learning this, that there's these EEG signatures for these different aspects of meditation. And then that kind of understanding by itself made me understand meditation better. And then the training also helped me in my own practice as well as helping other people. So there's kind of relationship between tracking and training and the subjective realm of how we feel and the objective realm of what we can measure. And this relationship is somewhat tenuous at times, but whenever we find these clear relationships, and we can then really utilize them to improve how we teach and then use techniques and devices to move things forward. So I think that sort of that kind of examples helps to put it in context. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, I think that's really great. There's a concept in the what they call neuroethics. So there's ethicists who are worried about, brain implants. Elon Musk has a company trying to implant chips in people's brains. Some of my work is using, and Sanjay's work, we use energy to modulate the brain and the body. There are these people called neuroethicists who worry about the things that we should be worried about this stuff. And there's a term called epistemic appropriateness. So the epistemic appropriateness is getting at the heart of what you're asking. So what's the point of the Fitbit? Its point right now is to passively track your steps. But if the sort of philosophical question or ethical question is all in how do you use that information? What's the use case? What is it doing for your own experience, for example? And there's a really great study out of Japan where they know that if you take a walk in the forest, you will reduce your cortisol, your stress, your heart rate, your blood pressure. Everything goes down if you take a walk in the forest. They call it a forest bath. Some people like to do it naked, maybe gives you a better experience, I'm not sure. But they have all these aging folks in Japan, and so they decided to try to motivate people to walk in the forest to give them health effects. So they put a Fitbit on them. And it turns out that people would walk about 1/3 more time in the forest, but then you measure their cortisol and their heart rate and their subjective stress, and they were actually more stressed after this walk in the forest. And they were confused. They were like, well, you walked more. The Fitbit said you spent more time in the forest. What's going on? And they started checking in with the participants. And what they found is that they started understanding their experience through the data of the Fitbit. So they were starting to get stressed out because they were counting their steps, like, oh, I've only done 10% of my steps. Now I got to walk faster. And, sort of in that culture, very much you want to conform, right? And so they were trying to conform, and their experience became objective instead of subjective, like grossly objective, actually. And so I think that's a bigger sort of analogy about the sort of situation that we're living in this world with the sort of Facebook and all the stuff that's happening for the younger folks, is that their sort of view of themselves is objectifying. And the question becomes, what's the appropriateness? How appropriate is this data and how is it being used?
Yeah,
So
I'm really aware of that, and then the dangers of that kind of objectification. Yes.
Right. So, we're quite aware of that in the lab. And that's why, all of the work has a lot of focus on the deep outcomes, even for the subjects when they're coming and doing our protocols. or they might get a 2-week meditation protocol and we do brain stimulation or psychedelic intervention, the focus up front is always on how is this going to affect your life, your whole life, all the way at the end. It's not focusing on the objective states. It's not focusing on the brain scan that we're doing. So we do MRIs on people, but we really just even focus the subject in on what's the deep, experience that's happening to you, and making sure that all the data that's being used is helping to help that piece and not, focus on anything else in the study.
Okay, good point. So I think I think it's good to, at least for people who are not familiar, so just put up some of your slides and tell us in a little more detail as to what you're doing.
Sure. And do we take questions as well? I'm happy to take questions from folks if they.
Yeah, but I want you to get started with the slides first.
Okay, sure. I think you need to give me control.
Right. Let's see, where are you? Okay.
All right, let's see here. There we go. Okay, can you see these slides?
Yep.
All right. So as I said, most of the work so far has really been focused on facilitating mindfulness training. So we're really about trying to find tools and technologies that can accelerate the learning of the mindfulness skills, and then ultimately the benefits, the deep benefits, which I think most people on this call are well aware of, and trying to use the tools of science to quantify all of that. So as you know, the field of mindfulness science, which is called contemplative neuroscience, specifically has been growing very quickly. So these are the number of publications going up to 2020, and it's just a lot of interest in the things that we've been discussing, how mindfulness is changing the brain and the body, and whether you can use that information to facilitate the mindfulness practice. We're starting to learn quite a bit about how the mechanisms work. And the mechanisms are both how they work in the mind, so how things like attention and emotion regulation are changing with mindfulness practice, and also the brain regions. And this is what gives people like me and Sanjay confidence that we can use tools like brain stimulation to target some of these systems. So a lot of my work, sorry about that, is focused on targeting this part of the brain called the posterior cingulate cortex, for example. This is a part of the brain that's really affected by mindfulness training. And so the science is still pretty young, but we're starting to get models and pictures of how the practice is changing the brain. And that allows us to go target some of those brain regions with brain stimulation. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, if you talk to long-term practitioners, like in this book by Richie Davison, who's a big mindfulness scientist, what you tend to see is that with long-term practice, you go from the state changes that can be very, very obvious to people when you're on the pillow to getting to trait changes or personality changes over the lifetime. And so really that's where we're interested in is, can we get people to some of those trait changes? So changes in sort of the way you react to anger or the way that you react to fear, for example. Can we help you get to some of those changes a bit quicker with the tools of science and with brain stimulation? But as I said, doing that in a way that looks like long-term practice, that looks like it's a functional, useful, and integrated way. And Shinzen, in his book, The Science of Enlightenment, likes to write lots of little quotes like this. Like, once you learn to taste purification through the practice, your growth goes exponential. So, in science, we love exponential curves where there's an inflection point and things really take off. And these are the types of things that long-term practitioners tend to describe, is that at some point, the changes in life are becoming multiplicative and exponential. And one thing that science can do is start studying some of these growth curves and trying to understand what are the conditions that lead to this exponential change. Is it safe to make it happen faster? Does it happen faster for some personality types than others? So we're really interested in some of these quantified questions that we can ask. And as we start developing tools like psychedelic interventions that facilitate these practices, start asking how fast can we make this go before it becomes not functional. We want to make sure that these things are useful for people in their lives.